buying vintage fragrances. So, vintage fragrances can be hard to find, especially good ones. So, where should you start? Most people, at least that I've heard of, tend to get their vintage fragrances from eBay. Now, this is not the only place you can get them, but it's one of the primary places. So, and I'm talking, so vintage is considered 20 years old, which I guess that makes at least 2004 vintage, which is kind of crazy, but when I think of vintage, I think of something from the 50s, the 60s, you know, the 40s, the 30s, that sort of thing. Now, it does depend on what kind of fragrance you're looking for. For example, maybe you're looking for a 1950 bottle of Chanel No. 5, you know. Most people go for vintage fragrances because that was how they smelled originally versus the reformulated versions that are available today. That's kind of true with pretty much every fragrance that's been around for a few decades. Obsession from Calvin Klein, Emerald by Coty, Chanel No. 5, you know, all the main ones. So, regardless of what fragrance you're looking for, you might be wondering, how can you make sure that you find a good vintage fragrance? So, the main thing is, if you're really lucky, maybe you're at like a yard sale or a thrift store and you find an old bottle of a fragrance. In which case, you're really lucky, because then you can smell it right there and determine whether or not it's good or not. Otherwise, you might come across some certain issues that, you know, maybe you accidentally buy a bottle that's just not good anymore. There are plenty of people selling vintage fragrances on eBay, for example, and not all of them are really good quality. Some have been stored improperly, so they're not going to smell that great, and it's kind of going to be a waste of money if you buy that type of fragrance. So, the main thing I always say before you buy anything is always check the reviews on a seller. And this is true of both eBay and any other websites that sell vintage fragrances. You always want to check the customer reviews. Obviously, if you find a lot of reviews that are like 1 star, really terrible, don't shop there. Find someone else, because you're just going to be another disappointed customer. So definitely check the reviews, read the reviews, see what people are saying. Now, on the other hand, you know, if people have 5-star reviews, they're saying great things about the seller, about their products that they receive, you're going to have a much better deal, much better chance at getting a high-quality vintage fragrance when you buy online, which is a difficult thing to do because a lot of people don't store their fragrances properly, they don't ship it properly, and that sort of thing. So, customer reviews. Now, besides that, you also want to make sure that the person you're buying from is reputable. You know, they're doing all the necessary procedures to be reputable, and because buying from a reputable seller is important, because otherwise they might send you something completely different. They might not send you anything and just, you know, attempt to take your money. Or, you know, certain problems just arise, and no one wants to deal with them unnecessarily. So make sure, again, besides just the reviews, make sure that the seller is reputable. They're not just some shady person on the internet promising some, you know, particular fragrance. But besides that, you also want to ask a few questions before you make any purchases. Say you find a listing that seems pretty legitimate and you want to know more about it. So you ought to ask the seller, you know, how was it stored? How old is the fragrance? Does it smell all right? You know, that sort of thing. So that way you have a better idea of how the fragrance is going to be if you decide to buy it. Because again, the last thing you want is to pay money, especially a bunch of money, and then the fragrance arrives to you and it smells awful because it wasn't stored properly, or, you know, some problem like that. So it is important to just ask questions if you have them. Ask them of the seller and see what they have to say. Now, I would say if you ask questions and the seller doesn't respond or gives you really vague answers, I would probably just move on with another seller that's more informative. because if they're vague, then maybe they're hiding something regarding that purchase, and it's, again, problems arise from that. So it's best to choose a seller that is, they'll actually tell you important information about this product. So you know what you're getting into ahead of time, and that sort of thing. Now, another thing to keep in mind, which is more about just your expectations, is that it can be pretty difficult to find particular vintage fragrances, especially that are in good shape. Maybe you want like a very particular bottle of something from the 60s or the 70s. First of all, it's going to be hard to find just because how many vintage bottles are just sitting around like that. So it's going to be more difficult to find. Second of all, how was it stored? Most likely, it wasn't stored properly. So it might not smell how it should smell, or how it used to smell many years ago. So kind of just manage your expectations of what to expect when you buy vintage fragrances. Also, like, the color of the fragrance inside the bottle is probably going to be different, mainly because, things just discolor with age. So if you're expecting maybe a clear liquid, maybe it's going to be brown, maybe it's going to be a weird gold color. So just kind of think about these differences and how this fragrance may have changed throughout the years. Maybe it's not as you're expecting. And how much of the fragrance is left in the bottle. Sometimes there's, on rare occasions, the bottle's full, it hasn't been used. In other occasions, it's probably almost completely empty. So as long as you consider all these different kind of factors that could come into play, you shouldn't be too disappointed. You should have everything sorted out and all of that. But definitely buying vintage fragrances is more difficult compared to buying modern fragrances where you can just go to Amazon and just buy whatever you want. But it is worth it if you manage to find a really good, really authentic, and really well-preserved vintage fragrance. So it really just depends on your luck, where you're buying these things from, how these things were stored, all that. So, but other than that, those are pretty much my main tips on buying vintage fragrances safely and properly, I guess. So you can hopefully get the best product you can, especially when you're buying online. But that is pretty much all I have to say about buying vintage fragrances. So hopefully you found this video helpful. And if you did, of course, you can leave a like, maybe subscribe, and I make videos throughout the week, so stick around for those.